opening space, therefore, to the next stage, namely the conversion of the human in a technological or cybernetic organism. And with all that, the truth is understood as a mere plan execution, with a purely technical function and without any ontological bond whatsoever. And even human freedom in this context would be something calculable and quantifiable. Heidegger does not fear technology per se, but he fears its imperialist predominance, its conversion in the only way of being in the world, and the fact that it could destroy everything that makes us humans, that is, the thinking. Technology stimulates the weakening of our thought, of our reflection, and this affects our very essence. And even though the power of the Gestalt is more and more comprehensive and ubiquitous, the act of thinking still remains untouched, as a last refuge for the human being. The Gestalt challenges us in a way that our thinking process is increasingly becoming imbricated with technology. And this is something unavoidable for us. We create and raise ourselves with all the material circumstances and significations that surround us. And we cannot totally convert ourselves in machines if we still want to be considered as humans. So the final part. So a purely technological conception of the world is something unreal and unachievable, since if converted in a complete machine, it would be not human anymore. We would be thus something non-human, which would be probably impossible. Technology and human beings are interconnected, and the progress of the former occurs in relation to the latter. The desire of our species to impose its domination over the world is part of this old modern illusion in which everything could be known through positive science and controlled by technology. Heidegger said that while we are humans, we will not achieve the very end of this process, that is, the complete transformation of all beings in machines will not be achieved. While human beings, we have a relation to reality, a way of being in the world. And if we lose our essence, everything else becomes meaningless. And that's it. Thank you.
So we've got about 6 or 7 minutes for general questions before we start the talk. So feel free to ask Fabio anything.
Please be nice. Oh, yes.
Yeah, I have a question which is really about the definition of technology. What I mean by technology, I started making a kind of little list of things which could conceivably be technology, like violins, cheese-making bacteria, writing, apples, wheat, books, paint, kinship systems, and so on. In a sense, those are all technologies. In a sense, are they themselves necessarily kind of inhuman?
I think we can trace this back to the Greeks, maybe with their techne. Yeah, but I don't think if that techne is the same as our modern technology. But probably a.
How do we make the distinction?
Yeah. That's a good question.
iPads.
Yeah, probably when technology it becomes this some kind of control over us. Maybe that's where technology enters the scene, and the techne, the Greek techne, is left behind, probably.
I didn't Plato complain about how our brains were being kind of transformed and in fact limited by writing.
Yeah, maybe even the writing process is already a technology. And that's one thing that when people say that, oh, I was writing in my old, I don't know how do you call this kind of machines that, and yeah, typewriter, thanks. And when we change and move to the computer, it's a whole different thing. So, but both are technology, but maybe this is like a more, in some way, it controls us more than the typewriting technology. I don't know if this makes any sense.
So I remember being very controlled by typewriting technology when I had to write my dissertation with a typewriter. And
So I guess.
Correct things.
Oh yeah, just to. Yeah, but it's kind of. But good question. Good question. Yes, Anna, please.
So Heidegger talks about technology with a capital T, and it tends to be very abstract. What does Heidegger tell us about a specific policy, about a specific thing, or is that not the right way to mobilize Heideggerian resources?
Yeah.
I mean, is he useful or relevant to policy?
Like the real world or something.
Yeah.
Sorry. Wow. Yeah, man. Now I'm sad or something. I don't know. Yeah, but probably Heidegger he didn't dwell probably very much in this kind of policy making, probably, and that's why like I am like making the first step, and then Kelli and Wei, they would try to make a bridge between maybe this metaphysical blabbering, and then to try to bring this to the real world where like real things happen and that kind of stuff. But I think we could and maybe we should use Heidegger to not to solve our problems, because we always will have problems and we have problems, but
Well, but maybe I can venture a sort of preliminary answer. I mean, I think the really valuable thing that you pointed out is to not be thinking of technology in terms of it being just this neutral thing that we just take up, and however it is that we use it determines it's sort of.
yeah, but we tend to think that it's neutral. It's some sort of it's a comfort thing, thought or something, but it isn't. So maybe if we try to overcome this apparent neutrality, that's a way to maybe apply Heidegger to our lives, like our everyday lives. But it's yes.
So I have a question about whether, based on what you've already said, I should be optimistic or pessimistic about the talks to come, right? About whether on a Heideggerian framework, science and technology policy is a possibility, because one of the things that you mentioned, and which matches my reading of Heidegger on these points, is that the human beings involved are not wholly, or not clear how responsible we are for the technology, right? We don't sort of exercise our will and make all the decisions about.
We don't have a complete control over it.
So right now, a lot of science and technology policy is precisely about exercising control over it. Right? Now, so should I be pessimistic about that possibility?
You've got like a minute and a half to answer that.
All right. So it's easy. I think neither pessimistic or optimistic. I think for Heidegger, all this in framing thing, it is just happening, and it's like it's unavailable. So it's kind of it's almost like if this this was our fate or something. We can, I don't know, if we like it, whether we like it or not, this is going to happen, and we must accept this. Maybe it's something similar to what Nietzsche said when he talked about the amor fati, like it's not like just, oh, okay, that thing is happening, okay, but you must love in a way what is happening. Just you must love your future, if it is like a dark future or a light future or something, like a very bright future. But it's very difficult to, I think, to try to be or pessimistic or optimistic reading Heidegger. I think in my view of Heidegger. So.
Okay, I'm going to time myself, so you're just going to have to trust me that I'm not cheating. Okay, so I want to begin with just a short blurb to sort of reorient where this panel is going, as a sort of point of orientation also for my presentation and for Chang Wei's. So the basic idea behind this is that since World War II, America has been the locus classicus of big science. That Vannevar Bush's influential report to President Roosevelt, Science, the Endless Frontier, instantiated a kind of contract between science and society that remains definitive, largely by default, of the relationship between the two. So perhaps the most germane part of Bush's contentions was of the apolitical nature of the scientific enterprise, and thus the importance of insulating the institution of science from the country's ever-shifting political climate. Far from pertaining only to science itself, the mantra of value-free became a scientific ideal and has come to color not only science policy, but also large swaths of society. So big science, however, also means big technology and vast socio-techno-scientific systems that span nations, ethnicities, and cultural histories. So inherent in the question of how to govern science is also the question of what kind of society and what kind of lives we want. So necessarily, values that were previously non-negotiable must be reoriented in light of a continual exchange of information from around the world. Science can no longer operate as if it were a value-free endeavor. After all, our future in general is contingent specifically upon the trajectory of future scientific and technological developments. Now, I've called my presentation The Sciencing of Science Policy, both for the alliterative flourish and as a play on NSF's relatively new funding program, which is called the Science of Science and Innovation Policy, and it's only been around since about 2005. And I think this program reflects a shift in thinking that I'm going to attempt to capture, a shift with regard to renegotiating the supposedly apolitical nature of the scientific enterprise. But our story really begins as all good stories do. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, it's a period of civil war. Rebel metrics striking from a hidden epistemic base have won their first victory against the evil peer review empire. During the battle, metrics advocates managed to circumvent the influence of the empire's ultimate defensive weapon, expertise, an armored ideology with enough cultural clout to resist bureaucratic upheavals. Marking this victory was the implementation of STAR metrics, and bear with me, this is a really long acronym. It stands for Science and Technology for America's Reinvestment, measuring the effects of research on innovation, competitiveness, and science. It's the brainchild of the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And this is precisely the rebel victory. Congress now requires, as attested to by the America Competes Reauthorization Act of 2010, evidence that significant return on taxpayers' investment in basic science is indeed being realized through societal benefits. And metrics, not peer review, were chosen precisely to provide this evidence. But what is the nature of this victory? And who are we rooting for anyway?
On the one hand, systematic and rigorous metrics are new and incredibly useful for tracking not only scientific communication in general, but the location and transmission of the best quality academic activity, which may turn into the next improvement in healthcare or the newest technology designed to improve our quality of life. On the other hand, healthy skepticism is something quite valuable. What is actually being measured here, and more importantly, what is being left out? Is it the case that the flow of knowledge can be quantified in this way without losing something essential in the translation? And if it's the case that something is lost, are metrics worth the price? Regarding this particular story, I argue that we ought to flip sides, that an ultimate rebel victory would mean dramatic consequences for science policy and for society. I read the current advocacy for more and better metrics to measure societal benefits and the impact of scientific knowledge as calls for making science policy more scientific. Such advocacy is more than a simple bureaucratic upheaval or administrative regime shift. It represents a repackaging of outdated assumptions about the nature of scientific research and the proper relation of science to society, and vice versa. Rather, science policy needs a repoliticizing in opposition to the tradition of depoliticizing the institution of science. Now, when I say repoliticizing, this by no means is meant to be antagonistic to the use of systematic evidence in policy. Metrics and indicators are often crucial tools when it comes to getting a handle on the scale and scope of interactions between science and society. But the transition from scientific to scientistic sometimes can be virtually seamless. And it's the fetishization of scientific ideals within the policy process that I think needs to be critically questioned. The fetishism with objectivity reflected in calls for a more scientific science policy sets up a dichotomy, peer review versus metrics, when it comes to evaluating the benefits of federally funded science. Contrary to objective, transparent, replicable, and perhaps most importantly, cheap metrics and indicators, peer review is rendered as subjective and biased, non-transparent, contingent, and costly. Therefore, as the argument goes, metrics are more desirable means of evaluation. But why the antagonism? I argue that this is a false dichotomy, in part because of the way in which bibliometrics are calculated. Bibliometrics are measures of the publication of and citation to academic works, such as journals and monographs, things like the journal impact factor or the H-index, probably is. These and other standard measures track scholarly communication through documents to quantify research productivity, or the quality, emphasis on the scare quotes here, or impact of the work. But bibliometrics deal with documents that have already been approved for publication through the peer review process. Even the grants given by governmental funding agencies to pursue certain lines of research, most of which result in publications, are distributed based on peer review processes. And so no metrics can actually be more accurate or objective than the judgments upon which they are based, judgments which are, in this sense, rendered through peer review. Metrics are also not necessarily cheap, maybe just cheaper. The prime example of this is Thomson Reuters, the company that owns and maintains the Web of Knowledge database, from which, and only from which, journal impact factors are calculated. I have heard them called the Death Star of metrics before. Thomson Reuters effectively has a monopoly over this data, so the name may be well deserved. And they're quite shy about discussing how the data are handled, what makes it into the database, and the methods through which the information is compiled and calculated. What they are not shy about is charging hefty fees for access to this information. So what lies under the scientific jargon that are tacit philosophical commitments to the premises, or dare I say myths, of terms like objectivity and transparency as normatively preferable in management and policy. So part of what it means to call metrics transparent and or accountable because they're easily replicable is an expression of the desire to streamline the decision-making process through the implementation of objective and transparent evaluation mechanisms. In other words, to science it up, which begs the question of whether metrics are really less of a black box than many claim that peer review is. Nevertheless, the push for quantitative metrics of research impact has gained significant political support both from policymakers and members of the scientific community. Julia Lane, the program officer for NSF's Science of Science and Innovation Policy Division, claims in a recent Nature editorial that, quote, measuring and assessing academic performance is now a fact of scientific life. I don't disagree. Rather, I want to emphasize that there are better and worse ways that one can employ metrics in science policy. Take STAR metrics as an example. Its goal is to systematically account for the societal impacts of federally funded research through the aggregation of existing databases of indicators into a standardized and automated process of impact evaluation. Several problems, however, arise from the use of existing metrics. The particular biases instantiated by bibliometrics, such as the journal impact factor or the H-index, have been well documented internationally, as have the consequences of their inclusion into national research evaluation schemes. The 2001 research assessment exercise in the UK, for example, was reviewed in 2001 by an independent third party, which noted a significant degradation in research objectives because of the assessment's metrics-only approach. What the report meant by degradation was given no further elaboration, but commentary on the report noted that researchers were incentivized to pursue safer, more certain lines of research, rather than high-risk, high-reward, cutting-edge, or interdisciplinary endeavors. Emphasizing quantity will get you just that, but there's no guarantee that the work produced will be any better quality. Lane contends that the above instances are evidence not for the shortcomings of metrics, but for the nascence of existing metrics. Thus, what is needed are better, more sophisticated metrics. But I think this point is too optimistic. It ignores the black box quality of metrics themselves. Adding complexity to measures that already instantiate unquestioned assumptions regarding what counts as quality academic research will no more eliminate those biases than a new coat of paint will mend rusting metal. In the development of metrics, questions such as the nature of research and what constitutes quality science are asked and answered beforehand and then brought to bear upon the research process in evaluations. What fits best with those particular answers is what's best accounted for, and what does not is not. Aggregating these measures into an automated process merely compounds their respective biases and further narrows the scope of what kind of research is easily counted and therefore best represented. But there are also other tacit philosophical commitments at stake. Lane's summary of reactions by members of the scientific community to these measures of scientific achievement and impact points to long-held beliefs about science itself. Quote, "Some argue that science is unpredictable, and that any metric used to prioritize research money risks missing out on an important discovery from left field. Serendipity remains a prominent argument against justifying the societal impacts of research. Basically, the argument runs that if scientific advances arise serendipitously, then the societal benefits of research cannot be predicted in advance. And Lane freely concedes that poor metrics can yield poor funding decisions in the interest of promoting positive impact. On this point, I agree. Many qualified individuals and much worthy research has been unjustly represented by biases in existing metrics, for example, towards less risky research and against interdisciplinary research. However, she also implies that better metrics mean better funding decisions. Quote, "It is true that good metrics are difficult to develop, but this is not a reason to abandon them. Rather, it should be a spur to basing their development in sound science. If we do not press harder for better metrics, we risk making poor funding decisions or sidelining good scientists." It is this jump to affirming that what is needed are better, more scientifically rigorous metrics that deserves some scrutiny. If sound science here means scientific certainty, or the standards by which scientists define and maintain rigor in their respective fields, then this affirmation amounts to appropriating the epistemic criteria of scientific knowledge for the sake of policymaking, of letting the facts speak for themselves as the best justification for making policy decisions. It is in this sense that the rationale behind the continued development of more scientific and technically sophisticated metrics to measure research impact is a repackaged version of Bush's linear hypothesis of societal benefits. The linear hypothesis essentially justified federal funding for basic research on the presumption of a contract between science and society, which goes something like this. Government contributes dollars, which are added to scientists' high-quality research, and this equals societal benefits and economic growth, certainly and implicitly. High quality in this sense ought to be judged, the argument goes, according to criteria internal to science itself. Scientists, after all, are the experts at judging quality science, and quality science is what results in societal benefits. The presumption was grounded in a belief in the superiority of the scientific criteria of objectivity and rigor for adjudicating political tensions that stem from interactions between science and society. A belief that scientific knowledge holds the key to solving political issues. And this belief is still reflected in contemporary advocacy for evidence-based policymaking. Science, however, is as much a political endeavor as it is an intellectual one. It is comprised of people practicing science in institutional settings which are embedded in a larger political framework. Anyone who has ever been to a department meeting knows that politics are an integral part of academic life. But science and politics are concerned ultimately with qualitatively different objects of study. Societal benefit happens at the intersection of the products of scientific research and their uptake into the massively complex and interconnected realms of society, politics, economics, and culture. Societal benefit is not something inherent to scientific knowledge itself, but is a result of human interpretation of that knowledge within a political setting. Policy is an intrinsically philosophical and political process. So by way of conclusion, I'll add that I don't think the serendipity argument is without merit. At its core is a belief that the institution of science is something different than the policy process. The conclusion, however, that this means that science ought to be as insulated from politics as possible, that it ought to be depoliticized, is problematic. On the contrary, what is needed is recognizing the inherently political nature of science as a social institution and the political reality of its governance through science policy. This would entail a long look under the lid of the black boxes that metrics invariably are, rather than an unquestioned presumption that better metrics equals certainty that the quality of our science is improving or that societal benefits are being realized. Measurement does engender a kind of certainty, but the question remains, about what can it be certain? Can it be certain regarding things which are not easily quantified, like happiness or quality of life? Moreover, numbers are cynical. In the words of Oscar Wilde, they can tell you the market price of anything, but the value of nothing. Ought we to be demanding mathematical certainty regarding the societal value of science? And doesn't the adjudication of values appropriately lie in the realm of democratic, political, and philosophical discourse? Thank you. So about 5 minutes, if you want to ask any questions, comments, spontaneous outbursts. Sure.
Try again.
So thanks, that was interesting, and I haven't been paying a lot of attention to these star metrics. I found it intriguing that you said Julia Lane is sort of looking at these as a way of measuring societal impacts, but then the examples you gave were things like H index and journal impact factor and so on, which didn't seem to me to be really tracking, what I might think of as societal impacts. It seems like a fairly narrow, impact within the scientific community or something like that. So I was just curious what your thoughts are on that. Are there some metrics that do sort of capture what I might think of as a broader societal impact, or is her conception of societal impact much narrower than what a lot of us might be thinking of?
Well, so you've hit on a number of points of contention in the debate about impact right now. So historically, and I say historically, but this is like the past couple decades, so it's not really that long, but mostly impact has been measured in terms of economic impact. So there are really good indicators of, say, R&D activity on the part of government that leads to commercialization of products, which leads to economic impact. But the realization recently has been that economic is not the only thing that we're looking for, and that emphasis on economic impact actually has served to devalue other forms of impact that might contribute to things like societal welfare. But then this gets at the question that we don't really know what we mean by societal benefits. Like, what are societal benefits? What do we want out of science? And this is a debate that really doesn't happen. I mean, it tends to be, we want to be competitive in the global marketplace. We want to be, as the president said, we want to win the future. But how does this actually translate into goods? I mean, is it the case that more healthcare research and the billions of dollars spent by the NIH actually leads to better healthcare? And I think the problem that they're having with regarding coming up with systematic metrics to measure societal benefit is A, they don't really know what they're measuring, and B, it's extraordinarily complex to trace according to the kind of causality that statistics or algorithms can actually track. So we may think of impact as, so I went to a conference and I had a conversation with another scholar that I'd never met before in the hallway, and he gave me a really great idea, and then I took that to my local city council, and then there was a definitive policy change in my city council, and people in my city are happier. but it's really hard to actually trace the sort of causal chain in the way that can be quantified and represented on the massive scale in which they're trying to represent it. I talked too long, I'm sorry. We have a couple minutes left.
Sure. I just have a little comment. I'm doing some work on bibliometrics of qualitative research. And so we're just looking at tracking publication patterns of qualitative research in health. So I'm looking at COPD, just a small sample. And what's really interesting is that only about 40% of the journal articles have impact factors. So it's a good example, illustration of one of the points you made, which is it is about reproducing a very particular version of what science is. And so from a policy perspective, there's some interest in actually incorporating qualitative research into policy making, but this sort of the stasis around what is correct science, proper science, makes policymakers reticent towards including it. So it has this, self-perpetuating process by which this research actually may contribute, particularly in healthcare, about patients' experiences in healthcare and accessing services, may not actually be used.
And self-perpetuating in the way that institutions and mathematics tend to be, right? And I use the example of bibliometrics because I don't think that any of the measures that have been designed to capture impact quantitatively have really gotten out of the problematic assumptions that we find in things like bibliometrics. So assuming what starting from an idea of a particular kind of research that you're looking at, and this being held up as the ideal of research. I don't think it's the case that any of the measures that have been proposed that Star Metrics is using, or things that have been proposed by the research assessment exercise, which is being called something different this year in the UK, or what's been done in Australia, I don't think the quantitative measures that they're using have really dealt sufficiently with those underlying assumptions to say that, yeah, we can get a comprehensive sense of what's going on in research broadly construed, and not just in very narrow particular kinds of research that we might want to look at. Sure.
So it was my understanding that Star Metrics and SIP are really looking for historians, philosophers, and others to apply. They're just not getting it.
Yeah, and I looked at, I happened to look this past summer at the proportion of grants given to SciSep and divided them up by their discipline, and it's overwhelmingly economists and economics that are getting grants through SciSep. So I don't think that there's any sort of bias there, but I think that there's not as many people that are doing policy studies or in public policy programs or doing philosophy or history that are applying for, even though this is really what SciSep is looking for, so they're sort of caught in a catch-22, that they want something other than economic measures of impact, but they're really just getting a bunch of economists.
Sure. It seems to me that things like global warming and stem cell research and, quote, death panels, unquote, are all examples of society wanting to make value judgments about science and about the control of science and technology and the money that the government puts into it. Is it your position that those debates are good debates, the debates that we ought to be having, rather than letting science just go ahead, science and technology go ahead with what it was doing?
I think they're good debates to be having. I think the question there is how good of a debate it is. There's a difference between having a debate and having a debate well. So I don't want to say that the debates are going particularly well in this country, but I think it is a necessary debate, and the pushback from the scientific community tends to be along the lines of, well, you guys aren't scientists. We're telling you this is the current state of the art of the information that we have, and you're rejecting it for reasons that aren't scientific, and we don't understand why you're doing this. Maybe we just need to educate you better in the sciences, so that you'll accept that we know what we're talking about. But I think that's a red herring, and I think it's a red herring because, as Britain is an excellent example, better scientific education does not equal a greater acceptance of scientific norms and values. So I think it's important debate to be having because the political arena is the proper arena to be having those debates. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Following Fabio and Kelli, I will focus on a narrowly topic, humanity policy and persuasive technology. As we all know, Vannevar Bush's linear model of science has dominated science policy in the US for almost half of the 20th century since World War II. In this model, basic research and applied research are dichotomous. Information flows in only one direction, from basic research to applied research, then to development, and finally to practical benefits. This model is also called reservoir model because basic research is just like a reservoir from which society draws information to create benefits. Under the protection of the model, scientists can autonomously do their research without the consideration of social benefits. But now, in the age of big science, both funding agencies and scientists are under increasing social pressure to show the relevance of federal budget devoted to research and development. The question with which the public is more concerned is not how much money should be spent on research and development, but rather what end is this money supposed to serve? These changes in the social context of science challenge the linear model. Its problems are showing. Firstly, it mispresents and oversimplifies a more complex science-society relationship. Secondly, it excludes social concern from setting research paths and priorities. Thirdly, the logic of this model is backwards. It starts with research and tries to prove its usefulness rather than starting with national needs and proving that research addresses them. Last but not least, as just said, it provides a shelter for scientists to invade their clue social responsibility because it assumes that science is value-free. In fact, science is value-laden. So scientists, like any other professions, have their social responsibilities. So as a response to these new changes, people attempt to construct a new model for science to replace the linear model. In 1997, in the book Pastor's Quadrant, Basic Science and Technology, and Technological Innovation, Donald Stokes put forward the quadrant model. He divided science into three quadrants. Barr's quadrant, which represents pure basic research, and Addison's quadrant, which represents pure applied research, and the third, Pastel quadrant, which represents use-inspired basic research. He claims that Pastel's quadrant has the most important meaning to current science research because it involves dynamic interaction between both considerations of use and fundamental understanding. A similar term to, I think, to Pastor's quadrant is techno science, which also shows that basic science and applied research are integrated and even indistinguishable. Similar to Donald Stocker's, Michael Gibbons and colleagues proposed a term mode 2. They argue that a new form of knowledge production emerges, which is context-driven, problem-focused, and interdisciplinary. It involves multidisciplinary teams brought together for short periods of time to work on special problem in the real world. So they label them mode 2 to make a distinguish with model 1. Model 1 refers to the traditional research, which is academic, investigator initiated and discipline-based knowledge production. Some other scholars also proposed new models such as well-ordered science, post-normal science, etc. But whatever they call them, they have one thing in common. That's the social needs should be paid attention to in the science research. So since the foundation of former science policy, the linear model was replaced by new models. So the science policy should be adjusted accordingly. And one approach, according to Robert Friedman, is to bring the normative and normative perspective of the humanity to bear on our policy debates in a way that complement the research of both physical scientists and policy scientists, thereby making their work more relevant to society. Friedman terms this approach humanity policy. As a means of resolution, it can generate opportunities for value clarification, enhancement, and transformation, which are different in present, which are deficient in present science policy. This policy calls us to embrace value reflection in science policy, applying humanistic knowledge and perspective to problems in order to clarify, explore, challenge, and redefine patterns of thought among stakeholders. To implement this approach, as we have just heard from Kelli, that the matrix is not have difficulties. So one approach, one feasible way to complement this is the review, peer review approach. That's to say, we should add the broader impact into the peer review procedure. This can help us to consider the social value of their research. For example, the human genome project devoted between 3 and 5% of its funding to a research program on the ethical, legal, and social implication of its work. It's the condition of the policy level. Now, I want to talk about the scientist practice. If broad impact criteria shows that funding agencies have studied to consider the social value on the policy level, then scientists should also take into account the social value of their work on the practical level. I will use persuasive technology to illustrate how they do this. Persuasive technology is coined by Stanford University professor B.G. Fogel. It means to use computer to change what we think and do. This reflects that engineers also begin to not only focus on the utility function of their product, but also pay close attention to what effects the product will have on the ideas and behaviors of users. In other words, the social effect of their products. By proper design, engineers can help users to get rid of some bad habits and develop the good habits, such as the food phone. It is a special application of mobile telephone with built-in cameras that are supposed to help obese people to lose weight. If you take a photograph of everything you eat and send it to a central number, you can receive detailed feedback on the numbers of calories you have eaten. Then you can adjust your diet in time if you find you intake too much calories. From the perspective of ethics, engineers are actually embodying the morality into the artifacts to regulate humans' behaviors. So in some sense, engineers actually engaging ethics by other ways. That's doing ethics, because they provide the material answers to the questions of ethics, how to live and how to behave. To sum up, in the era of big science, as the relations between science and society become ever more complex, both policymakers and scientists should take into account the social impact of science and take their social responsibilities. Thank you. apologize for my poor English.
So we've got about 5 minutes for questions. Feel free to ask anything you'd like.
What values, you talk about values, but what values, I mean, we sort of live in a pluralistic society. Whose values are we going to be incorporating when we do the policy analysis and the impact? I'm just curious, what kind of values do you think should be incorporated?
Yeah.
Whose values are, I mean, a democratization of values, which is about studying sort of values and decide whose values we're going to use.
Yeah, it's not a clear value. The concept of value is not a clear concept. I think what I always think about what's a good life. What's a good life? So I think maybe health, healthy, happiness, and yeah. I think values have many levels, from economic to the spiritual level. Yeah, I'm not sure. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay. Yeah. So, Kelli.
Yeah, well, if no one's got any more questions, then I guess we use the remaining time. We've got about 20 minutes to do a sort of round table between the three of us. You can ask us anything about our presentations, about how they connect up with each other, general outbursts or welcome. Yeah, so I think we should.
Just a question, sort of your backgrounds and how you all got hooked up. I think they said North Texas, but I don't know if you're all in the same department or what you're working on. But I mean, it's interesting how you fit together, but do you work together all the time, or what's sort of your background?
No, it's our first time. I'm from Brazil, and I am a philosophy PhD student at UNT. And I work mainly with environmental ethics. So that's why I use Heidegger in this sense. I think he's...
Well, we all work for the Center for the Study of Interdisciplinarity. Britt is...
Sorry, Britt.
Britt is the assistant director. He's our boss. But yes, we're all graduate students. Wei is a visiting scholar.
I'm from Zhang. I'm a visiting scholar. Yeah, and my supervisor is Edinburgh. I'm a doctoral student. Yeah.
What are you getting your doctorate in? What field is your doctorate?
My field major is philosophy of technology.
And then I'm in the master's program for philosophy at UNT. My background is actually marine science, but I'm interested very much in the sort of science, technology, society, and then ultimately how that comes to impress on the environment. So environmental philosophy.
I have some technology right here I got from UT Dallas this week. I have to ask you if you'll speak louder.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, okay, so there's microphones here. Oh, technology.
Technology is
Technology,
not
yes.
all that it is purported to do.
It is controlling us.
Right. Well, now this is new. They don't usually give this grad students microphones.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Solve the problem.
Thank you.
So, Fabio promised in his talk bridges, right, between the metaphysical, Heideggerian, and the more practical, policy-oriented stuff. And so, I think I see some connections, but I'd like to hear you guys spell out some of those bridges a little bit.
Okay. Well, so I'm mostly approaching this also from a sort of Heideggerian background, coming from a basic critique of science and technology as being this kind of inframing that conditions the way that we think about technology, the way that we think about science, but also the way we generally think about what it means to be a human being in modernity. What I'm seeing in science policy, which I'm trying to bring out in my presentation, is that there's this underlying commitment, which I think Heidegger identifies, to moving forward with technologizing all the different avenues and media of human existence. And I see that happening in science policy through this emphasis on metrics, on, okay, what are the ways in which we can sort of standardize and automate the means through which we evaluate whether or not our science is actually making our lives better. And so it's this commitment to technologizing particularly political issues, but also general issues that have to deal with what it means to maintain a democracy is what I'm trying to critique. And so science policy is a really handy venue for doing that.
Yes, and I think that we are not making some questions that we must I don't know, make, and probably this is where philosophy comes in. I think we really need to keep asking questions about what are we doing, or what. Or who are we? And I think we are taking many things for granted. I think regarding science and technology and the policy making that's behind it. So I think.
Well, and there's a lot taken for granted just in the idea that science is value-free,
value-free,
or in the converse idea that there are values in science, and it's difficult from a policy perspective to sort of negotiate having or bringing that debate back into the political realm without absolutely destroying any semblance of scientific expertise. I think the gentleman in the back has.
That's fine. Okay. I like what you're saying, that there's something that we can contribute, that we can do in order to problematize the metrics and to think more fully about these questions. But if we're only, right now we're listening, but what about, is this something, like what else should we be doing, or what else? It seems that if we're just talking amongst ourselves as science studies scholars, it doesn't help DC. It doesn't help with actual policy. So do you see yourselves as someone who does applied work as well and is, actually engaging in policy making, or is it enough to just think about it, right?
Yeah, well, not applied as it is now. I don't yet quite have the credentials to do what would be considered applied research. But I also would call into question that whole distinction between basic and applied as being something that you go off into your education and then you go do this applied research, and then whatever you do just gets taken up by whomever in whatever ways they wish to take it up, and you don't really have any control over that. It's obvious that you need some sort of educational basis for that, but I think thinking about what it is that your education is tending towards, and then where it is that you think you can insert yourself into particular processes to actually bring about some sort of definitive change in things. And I think that blurs the line between basic and applied in the sense that you're not just taking what you know and impressing it upon to a certain situation, but it's like an active engagement with what you know, how you know it, and different ways of updating your knowledge at the same time that you're sort of embedded in this context that might not be academic, probably is not academic. So Adam Briggle is a really good example of trying to actually accomplish this. He's been working with the Denton City Council about
and the gas fracking.
Gas drilling regulations, which he'll talk about later. And so sort of embedding himself into the context of getting into city council and using philosophical knowledge, but also constantly sort of reflecting on what it is that's going on in the particular context that he's in, to sort of try to act as both citizen and philosopher.
Yes, and I think he's trying to overcome this gap, and we have this gap. Some sort of we are talking here in a more theoretical level, and the pragmatical level it's some sort of it's far away from here in a way. But I think all this interdisciplinary study or work is they are trying to like fill this gap, but I think it's a long process, but I think we are having some progress. I think in this sense.
I mean, I think the interesting thing about being about what we can learn from philosophy is that you go home after class and you don't really stop being a philosopher. Like, I don't find myself stop thinking philosophically when I go home because, like, that's just my day job. It's not just a day job in that sense. So, like, when I was studying science, I would go home and I'm like, I don't want to think about science anymore. And you can do that, and that's sort of encouraged. This really stark distinction between professional and personal use is really encouraged in this society. But I think philosophy resists that naturally. So I think it's a really valuable addition of philosophy to say that when you go home, you're still a citizen, you're still a philosopher, and you can still act as a philosopher and as a citizen at the same time.
No, sorry, down in the middle. Yes.
Yeah, so I had a quick question about metrics. So there was a lot of talk about sort of metrics leaving out stuff, and I guess isn't part of the point of these metrics is that by making it completely explicit, we can then have this conversation about what is being left out, and it's not just a bunch of people in a room making a decision where later maybe you can interview them and ask why they made the decision the way they did, but instead it's a quantified metric, and you can go in and say, you're leaving out all these important values, and then maybe they can eventually be incorporated into the metric.
So that would be great if it actually worked that way. And I say that for two reasons. One, because the quantifications themselves have a number of embedded assumptions that don't get aired, that aren't made explicit, and do so to the detriment of precisely the dialogue that you want to have. And also because we always have to keep in mind who is doing the calculations and who it is that's compiling the data. And I use Thomson Reuters as a prominent example because they have explicit and complete control over how it is that data is compiled, cleaned, calculated, and then expressed to everyone else. I mean, it's essentially an information monopoly, and I don't see that changing.
So that doesn't seem to be a problem with metrics per se, right? That's a problem with
the industrialization of it.
Yeah.
Okay. But the problem with metrics is the former point, that there are assumptions in the very activity of gathering data and compiling it in specific ways that assumes a lot that doesn't get brought to the fore. So the point of having critiques of metrics is not to say metrics are illegitimate, that metrics shouldn't be used, that they're inappropriate in any context whatsoever, but precisely to bring up those assumptions for the sake of, whatever you want to bring up those assumptions, to say that they don't belong in particular policy processes, to say that they have these assumptions and we need to address them to make the metrics better. I say that metrics have a use in science policy, but it shouldn't be the sort of automatic thing where we just compile the data, this is what the data says, okay, it's self-evident. It's not self-evident.
Yes, I think we only ask how, but we don't ask why or something like that.
Yeah, so a lot of the conversation has been how are the metrics made and not why and what for and by whom.
Yeah, and by whom, yes. And I think probably, I don't know, that all metrics, they are tainted in a way, like value tainted, or because they, I don't know, they are not objective, but we I don't know, we tend to think that, oh, that's very, it's a very reliable and objective source of measurement.
So maybe in that sense you mean like they're
Not
shrouded in myth. I mean, I would call that.
Yeah, it's better.
I would call that a kind of mythologizing.
Yeah.
There's this narrative of objectivity that's sort of been built up around.
And it's yeah, it's on the metrics.
There were other questions as well. I think this gentleman hasn't spoken.
I'll stand up just so I'm not trying to talk through a bunch of people at you. I noticed that power was a theme in all three talks, and I just wanted to push you a bit more to think about the notion of power, especially with respect to the agents or actors that are involved and the kinds of system of power that you're looking at. So in terms of the agents or the actors, I mean, you talk about certainly the power that policymakers have over scientists, and maybe a little bit about the power that scientists have over the rest of society. But you don't have, for example, the public as an agent with power in this process. Even making a critical point that the public doesn't have power in this process and should. And then the second issue is in terms of the systems of power, the institutions for power that we have. So you focused a lot on government and public policy as one institution here. But what about, for example, the market? Monsanto has enormous influence over the kinds of uses that genetic engineering is put to. And this is by way of the market.
Really good question.
Yeah.
Good points. I think you're exactly right that power is a theme in all of this, and it's always going to be a theme when we're talking about politics and things in the sphere of the political. I know I've been looking at this from the sense of government-funded science and the relation between science and funding institutions, just because that's a sort of convenient pairing to look at. I mean, it's obviously incredibly more complicated when you get into issues of market forces and how it is that the economic comes to impress upon institutional structures and structures of governance. But I see this whole movement that what Fabio has talked about Heidegger's critique of science and technology, and what Wei is talking about with the introduction of persuasive technologies. I see this all as being backgrounded by neoliberal assumptions, neoliberal economic assumptions. And so that's like a sort of implicit factor that needs to be dealt with, obviously. I mean, the amount of time that we have was sort of, I think it is necessary, as you point out, to bring up that the public is given sort of short shrift in these narratives. And I think it seems to me, for reasons both of the fact that they seem disempowered in the policy process, but also because there generally seems to be very specific avenues through which the public is wont to engage with science and with institutional structures of governance. And that, in a lot of sense, those avenues turn out to be things that a lot of intellectuals will consider illegitimate, like intelligent design and the debate over abortion. And it's obvious that the public is trying to articulate something. People in the public are trying to articulate something, but it's not necessarily in the same language as we're used to dealing with in the academy. And so it becomes sort of difficult to identify who is speaking, why they're speaking, and how it is that we can take this up into our thinking.
Yeah, and I really think that we don't live in a democracy. I think we live in an oligarchy. It's like yeah, I don't know, because it seems that this power it is on the hands of these few groups, and the people really don't have, I think, a voice or a power to change much. I think it's kind of pessimistic, maybe.
I was just gonna say.
Yeah.
Whoa, pessimistic.
Sorry about that. But yeah, the power is.
Lei, did you want to add anything to it?
Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, we've got like a minute. Does anyone want to ask like a really quick? Go for it.
Just sort of following up on the remark about the market. In Michael Polanyi's book, I think it's The Logic of Liberty, he talks about, he makes an analogy between the common law system, the market system, and the system of science. He says that, and you might add also the system of the arts, where you have a kind of social body that is not governmental, that has its own organic, historical system for creating its own, for what it creates, and it has, justice for the legal system and profit in the largest sense for the market system and knowledge and so on, truth, I suppose, or asymptotic approach to truth in the scientific system. And he made quite a strong critique of the idea that everything should be reduced to top-down governmental power, even if it's top-down governmental power that comes directly out of participatory democracy. That there are intermediate organizations that can constitute civil society, and that they are very valuable. How would you respond to that way of looking at things? Should we have a single set of values of what is good, what is better, health, happiness, presumably freedom, but then that makes things much more complicated. Or should we have these intermediate systems like the arts, believe go for beauty and so on, science goes for knowledge and so on, and to some extent let them do their own thing. Maybe Vannevar Bush was not so wrong.
Well, I think so. I think that Polanyi's sort of taxonomy is expressed in this country as like blank industrial complex, right? So like health industrial complex, science industrial complex, economic industrial complex, things like this. So obviously I would resist as well just the sort of top-down governmental imposition of one sort of homogenized set of values that governs all of our democratic participation.
It doesn't work.
But there's a sense in which you can say that that's already happening because of the expanse of the market and the imposition of market forces into basically every avenue of human existence. So there is one set of value that does predominate, and this happens to be the value of capital. I don't really have an answer in the sense of what to do about this. But I think that having the sort of political discourse where values are made explicit, in the sense of it's not that the public is just this rabble and they don't know what they want, but the debate of intelligent design is expressing something legitimate, and that needs to be given a sort of political voice in the sense that institutions that are involved in these different industrial complexes can't just say, well, that's fine, you can just do what you want to do, and we're just going to be over here doing what we do. Because it's not the case that science is separate from society. So I don't think Vannevar Bush was right about that. There is something to be said for judging scientific knowledge by scientific criteria for excellence. That it's something quite different to say that once that knowledge gets into the public, science has no responsibility for it.
I think we ran out of time.
All right, let's thank our panel.